When you're in business, you want to work with other people, whether you're bringing them on as employees or subcontractors, contractors, consultants, distributors, all sorts of joint venture partners, all sorts of people that you have the opportunity to work with. So probably the first place to start is, how do you actually want to work with this person? And employment law these days in Australia is challenging. If you've never taken on employees before, I can remember when I took on my first employee and it was terrifying. But it's actually not so bad once you get used to the idea and how the system works. However, if you're just starting out and you don't have a really secure position, you might look at engaging someone on a different basis, as a contractor, for example. Now, if you're going to take them on as a contractor, they have to be a genuine contractor, not an employee. And probably the most fundamental differentiation between a contractor and an employee is a contractor is working for the benefit of their business, and an employee is working for the benefit of your business. So even though a contractor might be doing things within your business for you, they're working for their business. So you're less likely to have control over the way in which they complete the work you ask them to do. You will want them to be an independent setup, so they may be a sole trader with an ABN, they may be a P2Y Ltd company, they may be an outsourcer overseas. Whatever way they're set up, you need to be aware of that and how that affects your obligations. So for example, if you take on someone as a contractor, if they're doing hourly rate work, it's called personal services income. If they're doing some sort of service that you pay them per hour for, as opposed to in a results-based contract. So a results-based contract may be they're preparing a report for you and you pay them on the basis of the report, not how many hours it took them to pull it together. A personal services income hourly based contractor, you need to pay their super. That is your legal obligation. You can't get around it. So you have to have that set up. It's a lot easier nowadays with single touch payroll and that kind of thing, but be aware of that. If you're bringing them on as a contractor and it's a results-based contract and they're going to produce a report and you're going to pay them a fixed sum of money for that report, then you don't have to pay their super. So it's important to understand those differences and get advice if you don't. So that's fundamentally sort of basics of employees versus contractors. Now, there are other types of relationships. When you bring on employees, you've got to consider whether they're full-time, part-time, casual. They might be contract-based. So, for example, clients who get government funding might bring on employees on a contract basis as long as they have that funding available from that government contract. Perfectly reasonable and very sensible, because they may not have any ability to keep you employed if the government funding disappears. They're sorts of things to look at, and all of these relationships of working with people have different contractual obligations and terms that are best documented. If you are engaging people casually or on a part-time basis or even a full-time basis, you might have them paid part in commission. That has to be very clearly documented because there's all sorts of obligations around that too. But employment and contractor agreements are not the only types of arrangements you might go into to work with other people. So partnerships are not very common nowadays, and part of the reason for that is somebody who does something within a partnership can create a liability in all the other partners, whether they know about it or not. And a very common example is law firms used to be partnerships predominantly. If a person in a law firm took some money out of a trust account, if a partner in a law firm took money out of a trust account and the other partners didn't know about it, they could still be liable for it. So they could be responsible for paying back that money even though they knew nothing about it, because it's a partnership arrangement. So when we're talking to people about partnerships, you've got to be very comfortable in that relationship if you're going to take on those liabilities. Partnerships are most common between married people or people who have very long-term relationships. Alternatives to partnerships are joint venture agreements. A joint venture agreement is something you do still want to document, and you want to document a partnership agreement. But a joint venture agreement can be two companies working in partnership to create a product or service. Joint venture agreements are usually project specific. So they don't encompass the whole of your business. They might be working with someone to produce a particular product or service that both of you can contribute to, and then both of you can sell. And they might be time limited, they might be indefinite. We work with people, particularly in the digital space, who bring in different skills. So somebody might be really good at marketing, somebody might be really good at building websites, somebody might be really good at sourcing products, and they all come together in a joint venture. They create a website that sells certain products. They have it all running smoothly. They might be an unincorporated joint venture for the first 12 months. And then once it's successful and they see it's up and running and they've got their minimum viable product, then they go off and create a company, and then they've got a business that continues indefinitely. But the joint venture is the original project, and they might still have their other, the main components of their business operating in the background. These are different ways of doing business. If you're bringing someone into business, because joint ventures can become companies, and different people, again, bringing different skills, and they might have shares in a company. Then you'll have a shareholder agreement that sets out the responsibilities and obligations of all the parties, and what happens if it comes to an end. So when you're working with other people, that's something not everyone considers. And sometimes I've heard people say, well, I don't want to think about that because this is going to be successful and we're never going to bring it to an end. Let's be realistic. Things come to an end. People get exhausted, they change their mind, they move countries, all sorts of things happen. And in those circumstances, what is going to happen to the business? So who's going to get the assets? Who's going to be entitled to the IP? Who's going to pay the debts? All these sorts of things. Who's going to be responsible for the employees? These are sorts of things that need to be considered before or at the beginning of the relationship. And then you revisit these things every 6 to 12 months. And the reason you do that is businesses change, they grow, they evolve. If you're looking at the business every 6 to 12 months, then you're keeping the structure that you're using, the contracts that you're using, the agreements you've got, all appropriate for what you're doing at the time. We see some people who go into business and the agreements might be 20 years old and the business looks entirely different now to what it did 20 years ago. What they had in place 20 years ago is no longer fit for purpose. So it's time for a review, a refresher, an update, looking forward for the next, probably not 20 years, maybe the next 5 to 10 years, and putting those arrangements and those agreements in place for that period of time. So know who you're going into business with, know why you're going into business with them, and the structure you're going to use, whether it's a joint venture, whether it's a company that you set up together, whether you go into a trust together or a partnership, or you employ them in some way, shape or form. Understand that, and then also understand how it's going to come to an end and what's going to happen when it does. That's all sorts of things you should think about before you jump into doing business with other people.